My coworkers thought they were so clever when they deleted all my project files the night before the biggest presentation of my career. They smirked as I frantically searched through empty folders, whispering among themselves about how the privileged little princess was finally getting what she deserved. What they didn't know was that I had backup files, 3 years of preparation, and something else they never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I walked into that boardroom and delivered the presentation that would change everything, their faces went white as I announced that effective immediately, I would be stepping into my role as the new CEO. My father had been watching from the back of the room the entire time. The morning I started at Hartwell Marketing as a junior account coordinator, I made a conscious decision that would shape the next 3 years of my professional life. I would never mention who my father was. I would earn my place through merit alone, build relationships based on my work rather than my connections, and prove that I belonged in this industry, not because of my last name, but because of my talent and dedication. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time, the noble approach that would give me credibility and self-respect. I had no idea how much that decision would cost me. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 25 I was determined to make my mark in the competitive world of advertising and marketing. Fresh out of Northwestern with an MBA in marketing and communications, I had chosen Hartwell Marketing specifically because it was one of the few major agencies where my father's influence didn't extend. Richard Mitchell, CEO and founder of Mitchell Global Enterprises, had built an empire spanning real estate development, technology investments, and media holdings. His name opened doors, commanded respect, and came with expectations I wasn't sure I could meet, so I decided not to use it. Hartwell Marketing occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown Chicago office building, known for its innovative campaigns and prestigious client roster. The company culture buzzed with creative energy, competitive drive, and the kind of intensity that either energized you or burned you out within 6 months. I fell into the first category immediately, thriving on the fast pace, complex challenges, and constant opportunity to learn from some of the industry's most respected professionals. My direct supervisor was Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-eyed senior account manager in her early 30s, who had earned her reputation through a combination of strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. She had short auburn hair, always wore perfectly tailored blazers, and spoke with the kind of confidence that made clients trust her implicitly. Jennifer represented everything I hoped to become in the industry, and I was grateful when she took me under her wing during those crucial first weeks. The team dynamic at Hartwell was complex, shaped by overlapping friendships, professional rivalries, and the natural hierarchies that emerge in creative environments. My immediate colleagues included Marcus Chen, a talented graphic designer who had been with the company for 4 years and harbored obvious ambitions for creative director roles. He was friendly enough, with an easy smile and collaborative spirit that made him popular throughout the office. Then there was Amanda Rodriguez, another account coordinator who had started 6 months before me and clearly saw my arrival as competition for the limited advancement opportunities available at our level. Amanda was petite with dark hair. She always wore in a neat bun, and she had a way of delivering cutting observations with such sweet sincerity that it took a moment to realize you'd been insulted. She had studied at a state school rather than a prestigious private university, worked 2 jobs to pay for her education, and made no secret of her resentment toward colleagues she perceived as having advantages she'd never enjoyed. I understood her perspective, even sympathized with it, but I also couldn't reveal the irony of her assumptions about my own background. The 4th member of our immediate team was Brian Thompson, a copywriter whose razor wit and advertising instincts had earned him recognition as one of the agency's rising stars. Brian was tall and lanky with prematurely gray hair and expensive glasses that gave him a sophisticated air. He had attended Yale and came from old Connecticut money, though he wore his privilege with a casual indifference that somehow made it more obvious rather than less. Brian treated everyone with the same slightly amused detachment, as if the entire advertising industry was an elaborate game he found entertaining but not particularly meaningful. Working at Hartwell meant long hours, demanding clients, and constant pressure to deliver campaigns that would win awards, generate results, and enhance the agency's reputation. I loved every minute of it. The creativity required to distill complex brand messages into compelling narratives, the strategic thinking needed to identify target audiences and craft persuasive communications, the collaborative process of bringing together diverse talents to create something greater than the sum of its parts. This was exactly the career I had dreamed of, and I threw myself into it with complete enthusiasm. My first major assignment came 3 months into my tenure when Jennifer assigned me to support the pitch development for Pinnacle Fitness, a rapidly growing chain of premium gyms, looking to rebrand and expand nationally. The project represented exactly the kind of opportunity I had hoped for, significant enough to impact my career trajectory but manageable enough for someone at my experience level to make meaningful contributions. The Pinnacle Fitness account had been pursued by several major agencies, and landing it would represent a significant coup for Hartwell. The client was looking for a complete brand refresh, from logo design and marketing materials, to a comprehensive digital strategy that would support their expansion into new markets. The budget was substantial, the timeline aggressive, and the expectations sky high. Perfect conditions for either spectacular success or equally spectacular failure. Jennifer made it clear from the beginning that this project would serve as an unofficial audition for more senior responsibility. The team member who demonstrated the most strategic thinking, creative insight, and execution capability would be considered for promotion when the next account manager position opened up. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was exactly the kind of opportunity that could accelerate a career by years rather than months. I approached the Pinnacle project with methodical intensity, conducting extensive research into fitness industry trends, analyzing competitor strategies, and developing detailed personas for Pinnacle's target demographic. I spent evenings and weekends studying successful rebranding campaigns, identifying patterns in messaging and visual identity that resonated with health-conscious consumers. I interviewed personal trainers, gym members, and fitness influencers to understand the emotional drivers behind gym membership decisions. The research phase revealed fascinating insights about how fitness brands succeeded or failed in building lasting customer relationships. Premium gym chains thrived when they positioned themselves as lifestyle brands rather than mere exercise facilities, creating communities around shared values of health achievement and personal transformation. The most successful brands understood that their customers weren't just buying access to equipment, they were investing in an identity, a vision of who they could become through consistent commitment to their physical and mental well-being. Based on these insights, I developed a strategic framework positioning Pinnacle Fitness as your partner in transformation. The concept emphasized personal growth, community support, and sustainable lifestyle changes, rather than quick fixes or intimidating fitness culture. I created detailed campaign concepts showing how this positioning could be expressed through everything from social media content and promotional materials to the design of physical spaces and staff training programs. Marcus contributed brilliant visual concepts that brought the transformation theme to life through dynamic photography, clean modern typography, and a color palette that felt both energizing and sophisticated. His design work perfectly captured the aspirational yet accessible tone we were trying to achieve, creating materials that would appeal to serious fitness enthusiasts without alienating newcomers to gym culture. Brian's copywriting elevated the entire campaign with headlines and body copy that spoke directly to the emotional motivations behind fitness goals. His writing avoided both the aggressive masculinity that dominated much fitness advertising and the superficial vanity appeals that turned off more thoughtful consumers. Instead, he crafted messages about personal empowerment, community connection, and the satisfaction of achieving goals through consistent effort. Amanda's contributions focused on digital strategy and social media integration, areas where she had developed genuine expertise during her time at Hartwell. She proposed innovative ways to use technology for community building, from virtual workout partnerships and progress tracking systems, to user-generated content campaigns that would showcase real customer transformations rather than professional models. Working together, our team created what I believed was the strongest pitch package I had ever seen. The strategic foundation was solid, the creative execution was inspired, and the implementation plan was both ambitious and realistic. We had addressed every element of Pinnacle's brief while adding strategic insights they hadn't even known to request. I felt confident that we had created something genuinely special, the kind of campaign that could redefine how fitness brands connected with their audiences. The collaborative process hadn't always been smooth. Amanda made frequent comments about how easy it must be for people with expensive educations to generate big ideas, implying that my contributions were somehow less valuable because they hadn't required the same personal sacrifice her achievements represent. Marcus occasionally seemed frustrated when I pushed back on design concepts that didn't align with our strategic objectives, interpreting my feedback as micromanagement rather than collaborative refinement. Brian treated the entire project with his characteristic detachment, producing excellent work while maintaining an air of amused superiority that could be exhausting to work around. Despite these interpersonal tensions, I thought we had found a way to channel our different perspectives and working styles into stronger creative outputs. The friction generated better ideas, the diverse viewpoints created more comprehensive solutions, and the competitive dynamic pushed everyone to perform at their highest level. I believed we were functioning as an effective team. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Each member contributing their strengths while learning from others' expertise. I was wrong about several things. 2 weeks before the Pinnacle presentation, Jennifer called me into her office with an expression I couldn't quite read. She closed the door behind me and gestured for me to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing her desk. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the awards and industry recognition that lined her office wall. "Sarah, I need to discuss something important with you regarding the Pinnacle project," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "I've been reviewing the team's contributions, and I have some concerns about the distribution of work and recognition." My stomach dropped as I tried to interpret her meaning. Had I overstepped somehow, failed to give adequate credit to my teammates, taken on responsibilities that weren't appropriate for my level? "I'm not sure I understand," I replied carefully. "Could you be more specific about the concern?" Jennifer leaned back in her chair, studying me with the analytical gaze she typically reserved for reviewing campaign metrics. "Amanda and Marcus have expressed some frustration about the project dynamic. They feel that you've been taking credit for ideas that emerged from collaborative discussions, positioning yourself as the strategic lead when this was supposed to be a team effort." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I had been meticulous about documenting individual contributions, crediting others' ideas in every presentation and email, and ensuring that our pitch materials reflected the collaborative nature of our work. I had specifically avoided positioning myself as the project leader, instead framing my role as a coordinator helping to integrate everyone's expertise into a cohesive strategy. "Jennifer, I'm really surprised to hear that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anxiety rising in my chest. "I've made every effort to ensure that everyone's contributions are recognized and valued. Could you give me specific examples of where I've failed to do that appropriately?" She consulted a notepad on her desk, reading from what appeared to be detailed notes from her conversations with my teammate. "Amanda mentioned that you presented the digital strategy concepts as your own work during last week's client update, when they were actually her ideas that you had refined. Marcus felt that you dismissed his initial design concepts too quickly, only to present very similar ideas later as if they were your original thoughts." I felt my face flush with confusion and frustration. The digital strategy presentation had been a collaborative effort, where I had explicitly credited Amanda's foundational work while explaining how we had built upon her insights to create a more comprehensive approach. Marcus's initial designs had been talented but inconsistent with our strategic positioning, and the concepts I had presented later were significantly different solutions developed through multiple iterations with his input and approval. "I think there may be some miscommunication here," I said carefully. "I can show you the email threads and presentation drafts that document how these ideas developed collaboratively. I've been very conscious about making sure everyone receives appropriate recognition for their contribution." Jennifer nodded, but her expression remained concerned. "I appreciate that, Sarah, and I don't doubt your intentions. However, perception matters just as much as intention in team dynamic. If multiple team members feel their contributions aren't being properly acknowledged, we need to address that before it affects the quality of our work." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Jennifer outlining specific changes she wanted me to make in how I approached team collaboration and communication. I should be more explicit about crediting others' ideas in real time during meetings. I should avoid taking the lead in client communications, instead rotating that responsibility among team members. I should focus more on supporting others' initiatives rather than proposing new strategic direction. As I left Jennifer's office, I felt a mixture of confusion, hurt, and self-doubt that was entirely unfamiliar to me. I had always prided myself on being a collaborative team player who elevated others' work rather than diminishing it. The idea that my colleagues perceived me as credit-stealing or domineering was devastating, particularly because I couldn't understand how my behavior had been interpreted so differently from my intention. That evening, I spent hours reviewing every email, presentation, and meeting note from the Pinnacle project, trying to identify where I had gone wrong. I found instances where I could have been more explicit about crediting others, moments where my enthusiasm for the project might have been perceived as overstepping, and communications where my strategic focus could have seemed dismissive of others' contribution. But I also found extensive evidence of my efforts to collaborate effectively, share credit generously, and support my teammates' professional development. The disconnect between my intentions and others' perceptions was troubling, but I was determined to learn from the feedback and adjust my approach accordingly. I valued my relationships with Amanda, Marcus, and Brian, and I wanted to contribute to a positive team dynamic that would benefit everyone's career development. If my behavior had been problematic, I would fix it. Over the following weeks, I implemented every suggestion Jennifer had made, and several additional changes designed to address my teammates' concerns. I became more deferential in meetings, more generous with public praise for others' contributions, and more focused on supporting rather than leading strategic discussion. I stepped back from client communications, reduced my input on creative decisions, and concentrated on research and administrative tasks that would support others' leadership opportunity. The changes felt awkward and unnatural, like wearing clothes that didn't fit properly, but I persevered because I believed they were necessary for effective teamwork. I told myself that this adjustment period was part of professional growth, that learning to collaborate effectively in different organizational cultures was a valuable skill that would serve me throughout my career. Amanda seemed pleased with the new dynamic, taking on more prominent roles in client presentations and strategic planning sessions. Marcus appeared more relaxed during creative discussions, no longer defensive about his design concepts or resistant to feedback. Brian maintained his characteristic detachment but seemed to appreciate having more space to contribute his ideas without competition from other team members. Jennifer's feedback during this period was positive, praising my responsiveness to coaching and my commitment to team collaboration. She seemed satisfied that I had addressed the interpersonal issues that had been undermining our collective effectiveness, and she began giving me more complex research assignments that would contribute to other agency projects beyond Pinnacle. Despite these apparent improvements, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my professional relationship. Conversations with my teammates felt more superficial, collaboration seemed more guarded, and the creative energy that had initially excited me about the project had diminished significantly. I told myself these were temporary growing pains, natural consequences of adjusting team dynamics that would resolve once we established new patterns of working together. I was naive about several things. The week before our final presentation to Pinnacle Fitness, I stayed late in the office to review our materials one last time and ensure that every element was polished to perfection. The presentation was scheduled for Thursday morning, and I wanted to be completely prepared for any questions or last-minute adjustments that might be needed. This was the kind of career-defining opportunity that comes along rarely, and I was determined not to waste it through inadequate preparation. Our conference room was equipped with state-of-the-art presentation technology, multiple screens that could display different materials simultaneously, and video conferencing capabilities that would allow remote participants to engage fully with our pitch. The Pinnacle team would include their CEO, marketing director, and head of brand development, along with 2 board members who had specifically requested to observe the agency selection process. I had arrived at the office around 6:30 in the morning, wanting to run through our presentation materials systematically before the rest of the team arrived. Our pitch deck was comprehensive, including strategic positioning, creative concepts, implementation timelines, budget allocations, and measurement frameworks that would demonstrate return on investment. We had prepared for every question we could anticipate, developed backup options for elements that might need modification, and created supplementary materials that could address unexpected directions the conversation might take. As I opened my laptop and accessed our shared project files, I felt the familiar surge of excitement that came with presenting work I genuinely believed in. The Pinnacle campaign represented everything I loved about strategic marketing: the intersection of consumer psychology, creative expression, and business objectives that could create meaningful connections between brands and their audience. The first sign that something was wrong came when I couldn't locate our main presentation file in its usual folder location. I assumed I had misremembered the file structure and began searching through related directories, expecting to find it quickly and move on to my review process. After 10 minutes of increasingly frantic searching, I realized that the presentation file wasn't just misplaced, it was completely missing from our shared server. I tried to remain calm, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps someone had moved the file to a different location for security reasons, or updated the naming convention, or created a new version in a separate folder. I expanded my search to include the entire project directory, then the broader agency shared drive, then my personal files in case I had accidentally saved it to the wrong location. Nothing. The presentation file that represented 3 months of intensive collaborative work had vanished completely. Along with it, our creative assets, research materials, strategic frameworks, and implementation plans had disappeared as if they had never existed. I felt a cold panic spreading through my chest as I realized the scope of what was missing. I immediately called Marcus, knowing he arrived at the office early and might have encountered the same problem. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried Amanda, then Brian, with the same result. Either they were all still asleep, or they weren't answering their phones for reasons I didn't want to consider. Fighting down rising hysteria, I began calling our IT support team, hoping they could restore the files from backup systems, or identify what had happened to cause such comprehensive data loss. The first available technician wouldn't be in the office until 8 o'clock, leaving me with an hour and a half to either solve this problem independently, or figure out how to explain to Jennifer that our entire presentation had disappeared 12 hours before the most important pitch of our careers. I spent the next 90 minutes in a state of controlled panic, systematically checking every possible location where our files might be stored, contacting every technical resource I could reach, and trying to reconstruct at least basic presentation materials from email threads and draft documents stored in various locations. The process was like trying to reassemble a complex puzzle, with most of the pieces missing, possible in theory but practically devastating given our time constraints. When Marcus arrived at 8:15, I was hunched over my laptop in the conference room, surrounded by printed emails and handwritten notes, trying to recreate our strategic framework from memory and fragments of documentation. He took one look at my expression and the chaos around me and immediately understood that something serious had gone wrong. "What happened?" he asked, setting down his coffee and approaching my makeshift workspace with obvious concern. "All our files are gone," I said, hearing my voice crack despite my efforts to remain professional. "The presentation, the creative assets, everything. I've been here since 6:30 trying to figure out what happened and whether we can recover anything." Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, concern, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "That's impossible," he said, pulling out his own laptop. "Let me check my local files." For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. If Marcus had saved copies of his design work locally, we might be able to reconstruct enough material to deliver a basic presentation. It wouldn't be the polished, comprehensive pitch we had planned, but it might be enough to demonstrate our strategic thinking and creative capabilities. Marcus's expression as he searched through his files told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. "I can't find anything either," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is really strange. It must have had some kind of system failure." Amanda arrived 20 minutes later, followed shortly by Brian, and the conference room filled with increasingly tense energy as we collectively tried to understand what had happened and what our options were for recovering the situation. Jennifer joined us at 9 o'clock, her initial irritation at the crisis quickly giving way to professional problem-solving mode as she grasped the scope of the disaster. "How is this possible?" she asked, addressing the question to the room in general rather than any specific person. "We have backup systems, version control, multiple copies of important files. How does 3 months of work just disappear?" The IT technician who finally arrived to investigate the situation was a soft-spoken man in his 50s, who approached technical problems with the methodical patience of someone who had seen every possible type of system failure. He spent 45 minutes examining our shared directories, checking backup logs and reviewing access records for the missing files. His conclusion was both definitive and devastating. "These files weren't lost due to system failure," he said, looking up from his laptop with a puzzled expression. "They were manually deleted. Yesterday evening, around 11:30 p.m., someone with legitimate access credentials deleted the entire project folder and then emptied the recycle bin to prevent recovery." The silence that followed his announcement was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications became clear. Someone on our team had deliberately sabotaged our presentation, destroying months of collaborative work 12 hours before the most important pitch of our careers. Jennifer's expression was a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Who had access to those files?" she asked, though we all knew the answer. Only our immediate team members had the necessary permissions to delete shared project materials. "The deletion was performed using Sarah's login credentials," the IT technician added, consulting his access log. "Though that doesn't necessarily mean she was the one who performed the action. These credentials could have been used by someone else who had access to her password or session." Every eye in the room turned to me, and I felt the weight of their collective suspicions settling on my shoulders like a physical burden. I knew I hadn't deleted the files, obviously, but I also realized how devastating this revelation was to my professional credibility and relationships with my teammates. "I would never do something like this," I said, my voice sounding thin and desperate even to my own ear. "Why would I sabotage a project I've worked so hard on? This presentation was just as important to my career as everyone else's." Jennifer's gaze was steady but unreadable as she processed this information. "We need to focus on solutions right now," she said finally. "Recriminations can wait until after we figure out how to salvage this situation." The next 3 hours were a blur of frantic activity, as we attempted to reconstruct enough presentation materials to deliver something coherent to the Pinnacle team. Marcus worked on recreating key visual elements from memory and basic design principles. Brian pulled together copy concepts from draft emails and brainstorming notes. Amanda compiled research data from various sources and tried to rebuild our strategic framework. I found myself relegated to administrative tasks, gathering contact information for the Pinnacle team, confirming technical requirements for the presentation, and coordinating with Jennifer on logistics. Nobody said explicitly that I couldn't be trusted with substantive work, but the implication was clear in how responsibilities were distributed. By 11:30, we had assembled what could generously be called a preliminary presentation. The strategic framework was intact but oversimplified. The creative concepts were conceptual rather than fully developed, and the implementation plan was more aspirational than detailed. It was professional enough to avoid complete embarrassment, but it was a shadow of the comprehensive, polished pitch we had originally prepared. As we gathered in the conference room for final preparations, I felt a profound sense of loss that went beyond the immediate crisis. 3 months of intensive work, collaborative creativity, and professional development had been reduced to a hastily assembled collection of basic concepts. More devastating was the realization that my relationships with my teammates had been fundamentally altered by the morning's events, regardless of who was actually responsible for the sabotage. Jennifer pulled me aside as the others prepared our makeshift material. "Sarah, I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation," she said, her tone more disappointed than angry. "Whether you were directly responsible for deleting those files or not, the fact that it happened using your credentials raises serious questions about your judgment and reliability." "Jennifer, I swear to you that I had nothing to do with this," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. I would never sabotage a project that was so important to all of us. Someone else must have accessed my account somehow. She nodded thoughtfully but didn't look convinced. I want to believe that, Sarah. I really do. But I also need to consider the pattern of team dynamics we've been dealing with over the past few weeks. The feedback from Amanda and Marcus about collaboration issues, the concerns about credit and recognition, and now this crisis. It creates a troubling picture. The accusation was subtle but unmistakable. Jennifer was suggesting that my supposed difficulties with teamwork and credit sharing had escalated into deliberate sabotage of our collective work. The logic was superficially plausible, even though it was completely false, and I realized how effectively the groundwork had been laid for exactly this interpretation of events. I understand how this looks, I said carefully, but I'm asking you to consider the possibility that someone else is responsible for both the sabotage and the previous complaints about my behavior. If someone wanted to undermine my credibility and position on this team, creating interpersonal conflicts, and then destroying our work would be an effective strategy. Jennifer's expression suggested she found this explanation far-fetched, the kind of paranoid reasoning someone might use to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. Sarah, that would require a level of manipulation and planning that seems unlikely in a professional environment. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the most accurate one. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Pinnacle Fitness team, and I was forced to set aside my personal crisis to focus on the presentation ahead. As we welcomed our potential clients and began our pitch, I felt as if I were performing in a play where I had forgotten all my lines, desperately improvising while hoping the audience wouldn't notice how unprepared we were. The presentation itself was professionally adequate, but lacking the strategic depth and creative brilliance we had originally planned to deliver. Marcus's design concepts were competent but generic, missing the sophisticated integration with our strategic positioning that had made our original work special. Brian's copy was clever but superficial, lacking the emotional resonance and brand alignment that had elevated our initial campaign concept. Amanda's digital strategy presentation was perhaps the strongest element, benefiting from her ability to recreate materials she had developed independently and stored on her personal devices. Her section felt more polished and comprehensive than the rest of our pitch, highlighting by contrast how much we had lost when our collaborative materials disappeared. I contributed primarily through research data and market analysis, areas where I could rely on industry knowledge and analytical frameworks, rather than the specific materials we had developed for Pinnacle. My portion of the presentation was solid but unremarkable, the kind of competent work any qualified marketing professional could have delivered without months of preparation. The Pinnacle team was polite and engaged throughout our presentation, asking thoughtful questions and expressing appropriate interest in our concepts. However, I could sense their disappointment in the gap between our reputation and the materials we were presenting. They had clearly expected something more innovative and comprehensive from Hartwell Marketing, and our hastily assembled pitch fell short of those expectations. As we concluded our presentation and began the question and answer period, I noticed Jennifer's expression becoming increasingly strained. She understood as well as I did that we had failed to deliver the quality of work that would win this account, and the failure would reflect poorly on her leadership as well as our individual career. The Pinnacle team thanked us professionally, and indicated they would be making their decision within the following week after reviewing all the agency presentations. Their tone was courteous but lacking the enthusiasm that typically signals a successful pitch. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, I felt the weight of a career-defining opportunity slipping away. After the clients departed, our team gathered in the conference room for what Jennifer diplomatically called a post-presentation debrief. The atmosphere was heavy with disappointment, frustration, and unspoken accusations that made productive conversation nearly impossible. Obviously, this wasn't the presentation we had planned to deliver, Jennifer began, her tone carefully controlled. We need to understand what happened this morning and ensure it never happens again. Marcus was the first to speak, his usual collaborative demeanor replaced by obvious anger. What happened is that someone sabotaged months of our work right before the most important presentation of our career. The question is who and why. Amanda nodded emphatically. The timing can't be coincidental. Someone wanted to ensure this presentation would fail, and they succeeded. Brian's contribution was characteristically detached but pointed. While the IT logs seem fairly conclusive about whose credentials were used, the question is whether we're dealing with gross negligence or deliberate sabotage. All eyes turned to me again, and I felt the familiar weight of their collective suspicion. I've already said that I had nothing to do with deleting those files, I said, trying to project confidence despite feeling completely isolated. Someone else had to have accessed my account, either by guessing my password or by using my computer when I wasn't present. Jennifer looked skeptical. Sarah, that would require someone to have planned this sabotage in advance and taken steps to frame you specifically. In a professional environment, that level of manipulation seems unlikely. More unlikely than me destroying my own career prospect, I replied, feeling frustration overcome my attempts at diplomatic communication. I had just as much invested in this presentation as everyone else. Sabotaging it would be completely irrational. Amanda's voice carried a note of false sympathy that I was beginning to recognize as her signature approach to delivering criticism. Unless you felt like you weren't getting adequate recognition for your contributions, and decided that if you couldn't have the success, nobody could. The accusation was so unfair and psychologically sophisticated that I felt momentarily speechless. Amanda was suggesting that my supposed ego and competitiveness had driven me to destroy our collective work rather than share credit with my teammate. It was a plausible motive that aligned with the narrative about my collaboration difficulties that had been building over the previous weeks. That's not who I am, I said finally, my voice carrying more emotion than I had intended. I've never been motivated by ego or personal recognition. I care about doing good work and contributing to successful outcomes for our clients. Brian's laugh was soft but unmistakably mocking. Sarah, I think you have less self-awareness than you realize. Your behavior over the past few months has been consistently focused on positioning yourself as the strategic leader of this team, often at the expense of others' contribution. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my teammates systematically dismantling my credibility and constructing a narrative that painted me as a narcissistic saboteur who had destroyed our presentation rather than share success with others. Jennifer listened to their arguments with obvious receptivity, occasionally asking clarifying questions that seemed designed to build their case rather than challenge it. As the meeting concluded, I realized that I had been effectively convicted without trial. Regardless of the truth about who had actually deleted our files, the perception of my guilt was now established fact in the minds of my colleagues. My professional reputation at Hartwell Marketing had been destroyed as comprehensively as our pinnacle presentation material. Jennifer asked me to stay behind as the others left the conference room. Her expression was a mixture of disappointment and what might have been pity as she closed the door and returned to her seat across from me. Sarah, I want you to know that this conversation is difficult for me too, she began. I've seen tremendous potential in your work and I've genuinely enjoyed mentoring you over these past months. But I can't ignore the pattern of behavior and the evidence we've encountered today. I felt tears threatening at the corners of my eyes, but refused to let them fall. Crying would only confirm their perception of me as emotionally unstable and unprofessional. Jennifer, I'm asking you to consider the possibility that I'm telling the truth, that someone else is responsible for this sabotage and has been systematically undermining my credibility to cover their tracks. She sighed deeply, her expression suggesting that she found my explanation sadly delusional. Sarah, even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, the damage to team dynamics and your professional relationships here would be irreparable. Your teammates no longer trust you, and that's not something that can be easily rebuilt. The finality in her tone made it clear that this conversation was less about determining truth than about managing the aftermath of a decision that had already been made. I was being given the opportunity to resign gracefully rather than face formal disciplinary action, but the outcome was predetermined regardless of my choice. What are you saying exactly? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'm saying that we need to consider whether this situation can be resolved in a way that allows you to continue effectively in your role here. Jennifer replied, given the breakdown in team relationships and the questions about your judgment, continuing in your current position may not be in anyone's best interest. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the essential message. I was being pushed out of Hartwell Marketing, not through formal termination but through the creation of conditions that would make my continued employment untenable. It was a sophisticated form of professional assassination that would leave no fingerprints but would destroy my career just as effectively as any direct action. As I left Jennifer's office and returned to my desk to gather my personal belongings, I felt a numbness that went beyond disappointment or anger. 3 years of dedicated work, professional development, and relationship building had been systematically dismantled in a single morning. Worse, the destruction had been accomplished in a way that made me appear responsible for my own downfall. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a haze of administrative tasks and awkward conversations with colleagues who had already heard about the morning's crisis through the agency's efficient gossip network. Some offered sympathy that felt genuine, others maintained professional distance that suggested they believed the emerging narrative about my responsibility for the sabotage. As I packed my personal items and prepared to leave Hartwell Marketing for what would likely be the last time, I reflected on the decision I had made 3 years earlier to hide my family connections and build my career solely on merit. That choice, which had seemed noble and principled at the time, had left me vulnerable to exactly this kind of professional destruction. Without powerful allies or family influence to protect me, I had been an easy target for colleagues who saw my success as a threat to their own advancement. Walking to my car in the early evening darkness, I felt the full weight of isolation and defeat settling over me like a suffocating blanket. I had lost not just a job, but my professional identity, my sense of purpose, and my faith in the fairness of the systems I had worked so hard to succeed within. Tomorrow would bring the challenge of rebuilding a career that had been demolished through sabotage and manipulation. But tonight I could only process the magnitude of what had been taken from me. I had no idea that the real story was just beginning, or that the presentation I thought had been destroyed would soon become the foundation for a revelation that would change everything. The call came at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I had quietly submitted my resignation letter to Hartwell Marketing. I was still in my pajamas, nursing my second cup of coffee and scrolling through job postings with the kind of desperate optimism that had become my daily routine since leaving the agency. The number on my phone display was unfamiliar, but something about the area code suggested it might be related to my job search, so I answered with the professional cheerfulness I had been practicing for phone interviews. Sarah Mitchell. The voice was crisp, authoritative, and unmistakably confident in a way that immediately commanded attention. "Yes, this is Sarah," I replied, straightening unconsciously despite being alone in my kitchen. "This is David Chen, senior partner at Chen, Williams & Associates. I represent Pinnacle Fitness, and I need to speak with you urgently about some irregularities we've discovered in the agency selection process. Are you available to meet this morning?" My stomach dropped as memories of the disastrous presentation flooded back. Pinnacle Fitness had selected a different agency, as expected, and I had assumed that chapter of my professional humiliation was permanently closed. The idea that there might be additional complications or accusations stemming from that morning was almost too much to bear. "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. "What kind of irregularities are you referring to?" "I'd prefer to discuss this in person," David replied. "There are some documents I need to show you, and the conversation requires a level of confidentiality that's not appropriate for phone discussion. Can you be at my office by 10 o'clock? The urgency in his tone left little room for negotiation, and despite my apprehension about what new disaster might be awaiting me, I agreed to the meeting. David provided an address in downtown Chicago, in one of the premium office buildings that housed the city's most prestigious law firms and consulting companies. As I hung up the phone, my mind raced through possible explanations for this unexpected contact. Perhaps Pinnacle was considering legal action against Hartwell Marketing for the failed presentation, and I was being called as a witness to testify about what had happened that morning. Or maybe they had discovered some ethical violation in the agency selection process, and needed my perspective as someone who had been directly involved. I spent the next 2 hours preparing for the meeting with the same meticulous attention I had once brought to client presentation. I researched Chen, Williams & Associates, and found an impressive firm specializing in corporate law, intellectual property disputes, and business consulting. David Chen himself had an exemplary reputation, with a track record of representing major corporations in complex legal matters and strategic business decisions. The firm's offices occupied the 32nd floor of a gleaming downtown tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. The reception area was decorated with understated elegance, featuring contemporary art and comfortable seating areas that suggested both prosperity and sophistication. Everything about the environment communicated competence, discretion, and the kind of high-level professional services that commanded premium fees. David Chen met me personally in the reception area, extending his hand with a firm handshake and direct eye contact that suggested someone accustomed to managing complex situations with authority and confidence. He was probably in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that looked custom-tailored, and he carried himself with the assured demeanor of someone who regularly dealt with corporate executives and high-stakes business decisions. "Mitchell, thank you for coming on such short notice," he said, gesturing toward a hallway lined with elegant conference rooms. "I appreciate your flexibility, and I think you'll find our conversation illuminating." He led me to a spacious conference room dominated by a polished mahogany table and equipped with state-of-the-art presentation technology. A thick folder of documents was arranged at one end of the table, along with a laptop computer and what appeared to be a digital recording device. "Before we begin," David said, settling into the chair across from me, "I need to establish some ground rules for our conversation. Everything we discuss today is subject to strict confidentiality agreement. You cannot share any of the information I'm about to present with your former colleagues at Hartwell Marketing, with representatives of other agencies, or with anyone else without explicit written permission." The formal tone and legal precision of his language heightened my anxiety about what revelations might be coming. I nodded my agreement, and David activated the recording device before opening the folder of documents. "3 days after your presentation to Pinnacle Fitness," he began, "our client received an anonymous email containing what appeared to be a complete version of Hartwell Marketing's original pitch material. The strategy, creative concepts, implementation plans, and budget projections that your team was unable to present due to the file deletion incident." I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications of his statement began to register. Someone had sent Pinnacle the comprehensive presentation materials we had originally developed, the work that had been systematically destroyed before our pitch meeting. But who had access to those files, and why would they share them with the client after sabotaging our presentation? "The materials were remarkably sophisticated," David continued, consulting the documents in front of him. "Far superior to anything your team presented during the actual pitch meeting, and significantly more innovative than the work submitted by the other agencies in the selection process." Our client was naturally curious about why such high-quality work had not been presented during your scheduled meeting. He slid several printed pages across the table toward me, and I recognized immediately the strategic framework, creative concepts, and implementation timeline we had developed over 3 months of intensive collaboration. Seeing our original work in this context was both gratifying and heartbreaking, a reminder of what we had accomplished together and what had been destroyed through sabotage. This prompted our client to conduct a more thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding your presentation, David explained. "They hired our firm to examine the agency selection process and determine whether any irregularities had affected the outcome of their decision." My hands trembled slightly as I reviewed the familiar materials, remembering the excitement and pride I had felt when we first assembled these comprehensive solutions for Pinnacle's branding challenges. The strategic positioning was brilliant, the creative execution was inspired, and the implementation plan was both ambitious and realistic. This was the caliber of work that should have won the account and advanced all of our careers. "What did your investigation discover?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I was prepared for the answer. David opened his laptop and rotated the screen, so I could see what appeared to be a detailed timeline with multiple entries highlighted in different colors. "We uncovered a systematic pattern of manipulation designed to sabotage your team's presentation, while ensuring that one specific individual would be positioned favorably for future opportunity." He clicked through several screens of data, showing email logs, file access records, and communication patterns that painted a picture of deliberate deception and professional sabotage. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, but I struggled to process the technical details, while grappling with the emotional impact of learning that my suspicions about deliberate sabotage had been correct. The manipulation began approximately 6 weeks before your scheduled presentation, David continued, with a carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine your credibility and create interpersonal conflicts within your team. Your colleagues Amanda Rodriguez and Marcus Chen collaborated to document supposed instances of credit stealing and collaboration problems, building a narrative that would justify your exclusion from future projects. I stared at the screen as David highlighted email exchanges between Amanda and Marcus, messages sent during evening hours, and from personal email accounts that detailed their strategy for isolating me professionally. The conversations were clinical in their calculation, discussing which complaints would be most effective with Jennifer Walsh, and how to time their feedback to maximize impact on my reputation. The file deletion was the culmination of this strategy, David explained, clicking to a new section of evidence. Marcus Chen used your login credentials, which he had obtained by observing your password entry during team meetings, to access the shared project file. He downloaded complete copies of all materials to his personal devices before deleting them from the agency servers. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, whom I had considered a friend and collaborator, had been systematically working to destroy my career while maintaining the facade of professional cooperation. The friendly conversations, collaborative brainstorming sessions, and apparent mutual respect had all been performance art designed to position him for the sabotage that would eliminate me as competition. But why would he send the materials to Pinnacle? I asked, struggling to understand the logic behind revealing the very work he had destroyed. David's expression became even more serious as he prepared to deliver what was clearly the most significant revelation of our conversation. Because Marcus Chen had already accepted a position with the agency that ultimately won the Pinnacle account, he sabotaged your presentation to ensure Hartwell Marketing would lose the client, then provided the superior strategic work your team had developed to his new employer, positioning himself as the creative genius behind the concept. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking in its complexity and callousness. Marcus had not simply undermined my individual career, he had sabotaged our entire team's work to benefit his own professional advancement at a competing agency. He had stolen months of collaborative creative development and presented it as his own contribution to secure a senior position elsewhere. The competing agency used your team's strategic framework and creative concepts as the foundation for their winning presentation, David continued. They made minor modifications to disguise the source, but the core insights and innovative approaches were identical to what your team had originally developed. I felt a mixture of vindication and fury as the full scope of the deception became clear. My instincts about deliberate sabotage had been correct, but the reality was even more sophisticated and malicious than I had imagined. Marcus had not simply destroyed our work out of petty jealousy or competitive frustration, he had systematically stolen our intellectual property to advance his own career at a rival agency. What about Amanda? I asked, remembering her role in building the narrative about my supposed collaboration problems. Amanda Rodriguez was a willing participant in the initial phases of the scheme, David replied, but our investigation suggests she was unaware of Marcus's ultimate intention. She believed they were simply working to marginalize you within the Hartwell team, not to steal the project work for external use. The distinction felt meaningful but insufficient. Amanda had actively participated in destroying my professional reputation, even if she hadn't understood the full scope of Marcus's plans. Her willingness to fabricate complaints about my behavior and systematically undermine my credibility had made the larger deception possible. And Brian Thompson? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Brian appears to have been genuinely uninformed about the conspiracy, David said. His behavior during the crisis was consistent with someone who was surprised by events rather than someone who had advanced knowledge of what would occur. This revelation was somehow the most painful of all. Brian's detached amusement and subtle condescension, which I had interpreted as evidence of his involvement in the sabotage, had apparently been nothing more than his characteristic personality trait. He had been genuinely skeptical of my denials about the file deletion, because he had no reason to suspect a more complex explanation. Why are you telling me this? I asked finally. What does Pinnacle hope to accomplish by revealing these details? David leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from investigative precision to something that resembled strategic opportunity. "Our client is facing a significant problem. They awarded their account to an agency that won through theft of intellectual property and deliberate deception. The campaign currently being developed for their brand refresh is based entirely on stolen concepts, which creates both legal liability and ethical concerns they cannot ignore." The implications began to dawn on me as David outlined Pinnacle's predicament. They had invested significant resources in developing a relationship with the winning agency, approved creative concepts and strategic directions, and begun implementation of marketing initiatives that were fundamentally based on fraudulent misrepresentation. "Pinnacle has several options for addressing this situation," David continued. "They can terminate their relationship with the current agency and restart the selection process, which would delay their rebranding initiative by 6 months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost momentum. They can continue with the current arrangement while pursuing legal action against the agency and Marcus Chain, which would create negative publicity and ongoing uncertainty about their marketing strategy." He paused significantly before presenting what was clearly the preferred alternative. "Or they can engage directly with the source of the original creative concepts and strategic framework that impressed them so much. They can work with you, Sarah Mitchell, to develop and implement the authentic version of the campaign that was stolen and misrepresented." The offer was so unexpected and comprehensive that I struggled to process its implications. Pinnacle Fitness was proposing to bypass traditional agency relationships and work directly with me as an independent consultant to develop the marketing strategy that had been stolen from my original team. It was an unprecedented opportunity that would not only vindicate my professional capabilities, but also provide the foundation for building an independent consulting practice. "I should mention," David added with what might have been a slight smile, "that our client's investigation revealed some additional information about your background that makes this proposition particularly interesting to them." I felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach as I wondered what aspects of my history Pinnacle's investigation had uncovered. I had been scrupulous about maintaining the separation between my professional identity and my family connections, but sophisticated corporate investigations could uncover relationships that normal background checks might miss. "Your father is Richard Mitchell of Mitchell Global Enterprises," David said, confirming my fears about what they had discovered. "Pinnacle's board of directors is very interested in the potential for strategic partnerships with Mitchell Global's real estate development and media holdings divisions. Working with you would provide natural access to those conversations." The revelation that my carefully maintained secret had been uncovered was deeply unsettling, but I was also struck by the irony of the situation. For 3 years I had refused to leverage my family connections to advance my career, insisting on building professional relationships based purely on merit and capability. Now, those same connections were being presented as additional value I could bring to a client relationship, but only after my merit had been independently validated through the stolen work that had impressed them. "I need time to consider this," I said carefully. "This is a significant decision that would represent a fundamental change in my career direction." David nodded understandingly. "Of course, but I should mention that our client's timeline is relatively urgent. They're scheduled to begin major campaign implementation in 8 weeks, and if they're going to change course, they need to make that decision within the next 10 days. As I left the Chen Williams & Associates offices that afternoon, my mind was reeling from the revelations about Marcus's betrayal and the unexpected opportunity Pinnacle had presented. The validation of my suspicions about deliberate sabotage was gratifying, but the scope of the deception was more sophisticated and malicious than I had imagined. Marcus had not simply undermined my career out of competitive jealousy. He had orchestrated a complex scheme to steal intellectual property and advance his own professional interests at multiple people's expense. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to process the emotional impact of learning that my instincts about the file deletion had been correct. For 3 weeks, I had questioned my own judgment and wondered whether I might somehow have been responsible for the crisis that destroyed our presentation. The gaslighting had been so systematic and convincing that I had begun to doubt my own memories and perceptions of events. Now I knew that my colleagues' accusations about credit stealing and collaboration problems had been fabricated as part of a deliberate strategy to isolate me professionally. Amanda's complaints about my behavior, Jennifer's concerns about team dynamics, and the collective suspicion that followed the file deletion had all been engineered to create conditions that would justify my removal from the team. The vindication was sweet, but it was also profoundly disturbing to realize how effectively I had been manipulated by people I had trusted and considered friends. Marcus's friendly collaboration during our project development had been entirely performative, designed to give him access to our creative concepts while positioning him to steal them for his own benefit. Amanda's complaints about my supposed arrogance and credit stealing had been psychological projection, accusing me of exactly the behavior she was exhibiting. As I sat in my living room that evening, reviewing the documents David had provided and contemplating Pinnacle's offer, I reflected on the broader implications of what I had learned. The corporate world I had been so eager to succeed within was apparently far more treacherous and manipulative than I had realized. Professional relationships that seemed genuine could be entirely strategic, collaborative partnerships could be elaborate deceptions, and career advancement could be achieved through systematic sabotage of colleagues' work. The offer from Pinnacle represented an extraordinary opportunity for professional redemption and advancement, but it also forced me to confront questions about my own values and priorities that I had been avoiding for years. Working directly with them would require me to acknowledge and leverage my family connections in ways I had previously refused to consider. It would mean abandoning my principled stance about earning success purely through merit and accepting that strategic relationships and inherited advantages were legitimate tools for career advancement. I called my father that evening for the first time since leaving Hartwell Marketing to discuss the situation and seek his perspective on the decisions I was facing. Richard Mitchell had built his business empire through a combination of strategic insight, calculated risk-taking, and sophisticated relationship management, and I needed his guidance on navigating the complex dynamics that Pinnacle's offer represented. "Sarah," he said warmly when he heard my voice, "I've been wondering when you would call. I heard through business connections that you'd left Hartwell Marketing, and I was concerned about what had prompted that decision." The relief of talking to someone who genuinely cared about my welfare without hidden agendas or competitive calculations was overwhelming. I found myself pouring out the entire story of the past 3 months, from the initial complaints about my collaboration style through the sabotage of our presentation and the revelations about Marcus's systematic deception. My father listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but primarily allowing me to process the emotional impact of recent events by talking through them comprehensively. His response, when I finally finished my account, was characteristically direct and strategic. "First," he said, "I'm proud of you for maintaining your integrity throughout this situation. It would have been easy to compromise your principles or engage in the same kind of manipulative behavior your colleagues used against you. Second, I'm impressed that you built work of sufficient quality to attract this kind of attention from a sophisticated client, even under adverse circumstances." His validation of my professional capabilities and ethical choices was exactly what I needed to hear after weeks of self-doubt and questioning. But I also knew that he would provide honest assessment of the strategic implications of Pinnacle's offer, regardless of how it might affect my emotional state. "The opportunity they're presenting is significant," he continued, "both for your immediate career recovery and for long-term professional development. Independent consulting can be extraordinarily rewarding for people with your skills and temperament, and having a prestigious client like Pinnacle as a foundation would accelerate your ability to build a sustainable practice." I had expected him to be enthusiastic about the business opportunity, but I was curious about his perspective on the ethical dimensions of the situation. "What about the fact that they specifically mentioned your connections as part of their interest? Doesn't that compromise the principle of earning success through merit alone?" My father was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "Sarah, I think you've been operating under some misconceptions about how business relationships actually function. Merit alone is never sufficient for significant success. It's merely the foundation that makes other forms of value creation possible. Strategic relationships, family connections, institutional affiliations, and social capital are all legitimate tools for creating mutual benefit between parties." His perspective challenged assumptions I had held for years about the proper relationship between personal background and professional achievement. I had viewed my family connections as unfair advantages that would compromise the authenticity of my career success, but he was suggesting that this attitude was both naive and unnecessarily limiting. The question isn't whether you should use every available resource to create value for yourself and your clients, he continued. The question is whether you can do so with integrity, competence, and genuine commitment to delivering results that justify the trust people place in you. We talked for another hour about the practical implications of accepting Pinnacle's offer, the strategic considerations for building an independent consulting practice, and the long-term career trajectory that this opportunity might enable. By the time we concluded our conversation, I had clarity about my decision and the principles that would guide my approach to implementing it. The next morning, I called David Chen to schedule a follow-up meeting where I could formally accept Pinnacle's offer and begin discussing the specific terms of our consulting relationship. The conversation would mark the beginning of a new chapter in my professional life, one that integrated all aspects of my background and capabilities, rather than artificially limiting myself to arbitrary constraints about merit and family connection. As I prepared for that meeting, I reflected on the profound transformation that had occurred over the past month. The sabotage and professional betrayal that had initially seemed like career-ending disasters had ultimately led to opportunities for advancement and vindication that I could never have achieved within traditional agency structure. The colleagues who had systematically undermined my credibility had inadvertently forced me to develop resilience, strategic thinking, and independence that would serve me throughout my career. Most importantly, I had learned valuable lessons about the difference between genuine professional relationships and manipulative strategic alliance. The experience with Marcus and Amanda had taught me to pay closer attention to people's actions rather than their words, to document important communications more systematically, and to trust my instincts when interpersonal dynamics felt inconsistent or artificial. The second meeting with David Chen took place in the same conference room where I had first learned about Marcus's betrayal, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of revelations about deception and fraud, we discussed contract terms, project timelines, and the specific deliverables that Pinnacle expected from our consulting relationship. Our client is particularly interested in your ability to integrate strategic positioning with creative execution, David explained as we reviewed the project scope. The work your original team developed demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to translate brand values into compelling consumer communications, and they want to ensure that capability is preserved and enhanced in the final campaign. The validation of my strategic thinking and creative insights was deeply satisfying after months of having my contributions dismissed or attributed to others. Pinnacle had specifically identified the elements of our original work that reflected my particular expertise, and they were engaging me directly to ensure those capabilities would be applied to their brand development. They're also interested in exploring potential partnerships with Mitchell Global Enterprises, David continued, particularly in areas where Pinnacle's expansion plans might benefit from strategic real estate relationships or media placement opportunities. The integration of my family connections into the client relationship felt natural and appropriate in ways I hadn't expected. Rather than leveraging those relationships to bypass merit-based evaluation, I was being asked to contribute them as additional value after my professional capabilities had been independently validated through the quality of my work. The compensation structure we're proposing reflects both the consulting work and the strategic relationship development, David said, sliding a contract across the table that outlined financial terms significantly more generous than my agency salary had. Our client views this as a long-term partnership rather than a project-based engagement. As I reviewed the contract terms and discussed the implementation timeline for Pinnacle's rebranding initiative, I felt a profound sense of alignment between my capabilities, values, and professional opportunities that had been absent during my years in traditional agency environment. The independent consulting model would allow me to work directly with clients who valued my strategic insights, maintain control over project quality and creative direction, and build business relationships based on mutual respect and shared objectives. The meeting concluded with David providing detailed background information about Pinnacle's current market position, competitive challenges, and growth objectives that would inform my strategic recommendations for their brand refresh. The materials were comprehensive and sophisticated, reflecting the kind of thorough preparation that sophisticated clients brought to important business decisions. As I left the law firm's offices for the second time, Carrying a signed consulting contract and a comprehensive briefing package, I felt the excitement and nervous energy that came with significant new challenges and opportunities. The next 8 weeks would require me to translate the strategic concepts and creative insights from our original Hartwell presentation into a comprehensive marketing campaign that would support Pinnacle's national expansion. More importantly, the project would serve as the foundation for building an independent consulting practice that could establish my reputation in the industry and create ongoing opportunities for meaningful work with sophisticated clients. The professional vindication was gratifying, but the long-term possibilities for career development and creative fulfillment were even more significant. That evening, I began the process of establishing Sarah Mitchell Strategic Consulting, filing the necessary business registration paperwork and setting up the operational infrastructure I would need to function as an independent practitioner. The administrative details were tedious but symbolically important, representing my transition from employee to entrepreneur, and my commitment to building a career based on my own vision rather than conforming to others' expectations. I also reached out to my network of professional contacts to inform them about my new independent practice, carefully framing my departure from Hartwell Marketing as a strategic decision to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities rather than the result of workplace conflicts or performance issues. The responses were uniformly positive, with several former colleagues expressing interest in potential collaboration or referral opportunities. Over the following weeks, as I immersed myself in developing Pinnacle's comprehensive marketing strategy, I began to understand how fundamentally the sabotage at Hartwell had changed my professional trajectory. Without Marcus's betrayal and the resulting crisis, I would have continued working within agency structures that limited my creative autonomy and strategic influence. The forced departure had created space for opportunities that aligned much more closely with my capabilities and professional aspirations. The irony was not lost on me that the colleagues who had worked so systematically to undermine my career had ultimately provided me with exactly the catalyst I needed to discover my authentic professional path. Their manipulation and deception had been intended to eliminate me as competition, but it had instead forced me to develop independence, resilience, and strategic thinking that would serve me throughout my career. As I put the finishing touches on the strategic framework that would guide Pinnacle's brand refresh, I reflected on how completely my professional situation had been transformed. 3 months earlier, I had been a junior account coordinator struggling to prove myself within a competitive agency environment. Now I was an independent strategic consultant, working directly with sophisticated clients on projects that would shape their business development and market positioning. The journey from sabotage to vindication had been painful and disorienting, but it had also been profoundly educational. I had learned important lessons about professional relationships, strategic thinking, and the complex dynamics that shaped career advancement in competitive industry. Most importantly, I had discovered that authentic success required integrating all aspects of my background and capabilities, rather than artificially limiting myself to arbitrary constraints about merit and family connection. The foundation had been laid for the next phase of my career development, but I knew that the real test would come when I delivered my comprehensive presentation to Pinnacle's executive team and board of directors. That presentation would determine not only whether my strategic recommendations were accepted, but also whether I could establish the credibility and professional relationships that would sustain an independent consulting practice over the long term. The morning of my presentation to Pinnacle's board of directors, I woke with the kind of nervous energy that felt like electricity running through my veins. 6 weeks of intensive work had culminated in this moment, and everything I had built since leaving Hartwell Marketing depended on the next 2 hours. I had prepared more thoroughly for this presentation than any project in my career, but I also knew that the stakes extended far beyond a single client relationship. This was my opportunity to prove that I could deliver exceptional results as an independent consultant and establish the credibility that would define my professional future. The venue for the presentation was Pinnacle's corporate headquarters, a sleek modern building in downtown Chicago that housed their executive offices and served as the operational center for their rapidly expanding fitness empire. I arrived 30 minutes early, wanting to familiarize myself with the presentation space and ensure that all technical elements were functioning properly before the board members assembled. The conference room was impressive without being ostentatious, featuring a polished granite table that could accommodate 20 people and state-of-the-art audio-visual equipment that would allow me to integrate multiple media elements into my strategic presentation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city's skyline, creating an atmosphere of elevated perspective that seemed appropriate for the kind of high-level strategic planning we would be discussing. As I set up my materials and tested the presentation technology, I reflected on how fundamentally my professional circumstances had changed since the disaster at Hartwell Marketing. 2 months earlier, I had been a junior team member struggling to defend myself against accusations of sabotage and credit stealing. Today, I was presenting comprehensive strategic recommendations to the board of directors of a major corporation, positioned as an expert consultant, whose insights would guide their national expansion strategy. The transformation felt surreal, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that went beyond professional vindication. The work I had developed for Pinnacle represented the kind of integrated strategic thinking I had always aspired to deliver, combining consumer psychology, competitive analysis, creative positioning, and operational implementation into a cohesive framework that could drive measurable business results. David Chen arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting time, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of confident expression that suggested he expected the presentation to go well. We had maintained regular communication throughout my project development, and he had reviewed preliminary versions of my strategic recommendations with obvious enthusiasm. "The board is very interested in what you've prepared," he said as we reviewed the agenda for the meeting. "They've been particularly impressed by the strategic insights you shared during our preliminary discussions, and they're eager to see how you've translated those concepts into actionable implementation plans." His confidence was reassuring, but I also knew that preliminary enthusiasm could evaporate quickly if the final presentation failed to meet expectations. Board-level decision-makers had limited patience for theoretical concepts that couldn't be translated into concrete business results, and they would evaluate my recommendations based on their potential for generating measurable return on investment. The board members began arriving promptly at 9 o'clock, and I was struck by the diversity and professional accomplishment they represented. Pinnacle's leadership included former executives from major consumer brands, successful entrepreneurs who had built and sold multiple companies, and industry experts with deep experience in fitness, wellness, and lifestyle marketing. The CEO, Michael Harrison, was a tall man in his early 50s with graying hair and the kind of athletic build that suggested he personally embodied the fitness lifestyle his company promoted. He had founded Pinnacle 15 years earlier with a single gym location, and had systematically built it into a regional powerhouse through strategic expansion and sophisticated brand positioning. The board chair, Rebecca Williams, was a former marketing executive from Nike, who had joined Pinnacle's board specifically to guide their transition from regional player to national brand. Her reputation in the industry was formidable, and her presence on the board had been a significant factor in attracting the investment capital that funded their current expansion plans. Other board members included Dr. James Peters, a sports medicine physician, who provided expertise on wellness trends and health-focused consumer behavior. Maria Santos, a former CEO of a major retail chain who brought operational expertise, and Thomas Chen, David's father and a prominent business attorney who served as the board's legal and strategic advisor. As the meeting commenced, Michael Harrison provided a brief overview of Pinnacle's current market position and the strategic challenges they faced in expanding beyond their established regional base. The fitness industry was increasingly competitive, with new entrants ranging from boutique specialty studios to technology-enabled home fitness solutions, disrupting traditional gym models. The agency selection process revealed significant gaps in how we've been thinking about brand positioning and consumer engagement, Michael explained, setting the context for my presentation. "We need strategic guidance that goes beyond traditional marketing tactics to help us establish a distinctive market position that can support sustainable national growth. Rebecca Williams added her perspective on the competitive landscape and the particular challenges facing premium fitness brands in an increasingly crowded marketplace. Consumer expectations have evolved significantly over the past 5 years, she noted. They're looking for authentic community experiences, personalized service delivery, and lifestyle integration that extends beyond simple access to exercise equipment. The introduction provided perfect context for the strategic framework I had developed, which positioned Pinnacle not as a traditional gym chain, but as a lifestyle brand that created community around shared values of health, achievement, and personal transformation. The approach addressed exactly the market dynamics they had identified, while differentiating Pinnacle from competitors who remained focused on facility-based value propositions. Sarah Mitchell will be presenting comprehensive strategic recommendations that integrate brand positioning, consumer engagement, operational delivery, and growth planning. Michael continued. Her approach represents a fundamentally different way of thinking about our business model and market opportunity. As I stood to begin my presentation, I felt the familiar surge of excitement that came with presenting work I genuinely believed could create significant value for the client. The strategic insights I was about to share represented months of research, analysis, and creative thinking that had synthesized complex market dynamics into clear, actionable recommendations. Thank you for the opportunity to present these strategic recommendations, I began, deliberately establishing eye contact with each board member to create individual connection before launching into the analytical content. Over the past 6 weeks, I've conducted extensive research into fitness industry trends, consumer behavior patterns, and competitive positioning strategies to develop a comprehensive framework for Pinnacle's national expansion. I opened with market research that revealed fundamental shifts in how consumers approached fitness and wellness decisions. The data showed that successful fitness brands were increasingly those that created emotional connections with their customers, rather than simply providing functional services. People were choosing gym memberships based on community, values alignment, and personal identity expression, rather than price points or equipment availability. This research reveals a significant opportunity for Pinnacle to differentiate itself through authentic community building and lifestyle integration, I explained, displaying consumer survey data that supported this strategic direction. Your current members demonstrate high loyalty and engagement levels, precisely because they experience Pinnacle as more than a fitness facility. They see it as a reflection of their personal values and aspirations. The board members were clearly engaged with the research findings, asking thoughtful questions about methodology and sample sizes that demonstrated their sophistication in evaluating market analysis. Their questions also revealed genuine curiosity about how these insights could be translated into operational strategies and business results. I proceeded to outline the strategic positioning framework I had developed, which I called Transformation Partnership. The concept positioned Pinnacle as a collaborative partner in customers' personal growth journeys, rather than simply a service provider selling access to fitness facilities. This positioning would be expressed through every aspect of the customer experience, from initial membership consultations and personalized goal setting to ongoing progress tracking and community celebration of achievement. The Transformation Partnership positioning creates multiple competitive advantages, I explained, displaying visual representations of how this approach would differentiate Pinnacle from traditional gym models. It generates higher customer lifetime value through increased engagement and retention. It supports premium pricing through enhanced perceived value. It creates natural expansion opportunities into adjacent wellness and lifestyle services, and it establishes emotional barriers to switching that are much stronger than functional or price-based advantages. Dr. Peterson was particularly interested in how this positioning could be integrated with health and wellness programming that would appeal to consumers seeking comprehensive lifestyle support rather than simple exercise access. We discussed opportunities for nutrition counseling, stress management workshops, sleep optimization guidance, and other services that would reinforce Pinnacle's role as a comprehensive transformation partner. Maria Santos focused on the operational implications of implementing this strategic positioning throughout Pinnacle's current locations and future expansion sites. The transformation partnership approach would require significant changes in staff training, facility design, technology systems, and customer service protocols that would need to be carefully managed to ensure consistent delivery quality. The creative execution I presented, built directly on the strategic positioning, featuring visual identity elements, messaging frameworks, and campaign concepts that brought the transformation partnership idea to life in compelling and memorable ways. The creative work avoided the aggressive, intimidating tone that characterized much fitness industry advertising, instead, using aspirational but accessible imagery and copy that spoke to people's desire for positive life changes. The creative approach emphasizes authenticity and inclusivity while maintaining aspirational appeal, I explained, showing examples of how the positioning would be expressed through advertising, social media content, facility signage, and digital communication. We're speaking to people's authentic motivations for pursuing fitness goals while avoiding the shame-based or intimidation-focused messaging that often alienates potential customers. Rebecca Williams was clearly impressed by the sophistication of the creative concepts and their integration with the strategic position. She asked detailed questions about how the creative approach would scale across different market segments and geographic regions, particularly given the demographic diversity that Pinnacle would encounter as they expanded into new markets. The digital strategy component of my presentation outlined how technology could be leveraged to enhance the transformation partnership experience, rather than simply providing functional conveniences. I proposed integrated platforms for goal setting, progress tracking, community connection, and personalized content delivery that would create ongoing engagement between gym visits, while building the kind of customer data that would support increasingly sophisticated service personalization. The digital strategy creates multiple touchpoints for deepening customer relationships while generating valuable data about preferences, behaviors, and outcomes, I explained, demonstrating how the proposed technology platforms would function from both customer and operational perspectives. This information allows Pinnacle to continuously refine service delivery while identifying expansion opportunities that align with actual customer needs. Thomas Chen was particularly interested in the data privacy and security implications of the digital strategy, asking detailed questions about compliance requirements and customer consent protocols that would be necessary for collecting and utilizing personal information. His legal expertise led to productive discussions about how to implement sophisticated data strategies while maintaining customer trust and regulatory compliance. The implementation timeline I presented was aggressive but realistic, outlining a 12-month rollout process that would begin with pilot programs in 3 existing locations before expanding to new markets. The phased approach would allow Pinnacle to refine operational processes and measure customer response before committing to full-scale implementation across their entire network. The implementation strategy balances speed to market with risk management, I explained, showing detailed project timelines and resource allocation plans. We're designing systems and processes that can scale efficiently while maintaining the personalized service quality that differentiates the transformation partnership experience. The financial projections I had developed showed significant revenue growth potential through increased customer lifetime value, premium pricing capabilities, and expansion into adjacent service categories. The model demonstrated how the initial investment in operational changes and technology development would generate substantial returns through improved customer retention and expanded service offering. The financial model shows break-even on implementation costs within 18 months, with ongoing revenue increases of 30 to 40% above current projections, I presented, displaying detailed spreadsheets that broke down revenue sources and cost structure. These projections are based on conservative assumptions about customer response and market penetration, so there's potential for even stronger performance if execution exceeds expectations. Michael Harrison was clearly excited by the revenue potential but also focused on the operational requirements for achieving these results. We spent considerable time discussing hiring strategies, training programs, facility modifications, and technology investments that would be necessary for successful implementation. As I concluded the formal presentation portion of the meeting, I felt confident that I had delivered comprehensive strategic recommendations that addressed every aspect of Pinnacle's expansion challenges while providing clear paths for implementation and measurement. The board members' questions had been sophisticated and engaged, suggesting genuine interest in moving forward with the proposed approach. Before we moved to discussion and decision-making, Michael Harrison said, I want to acknowledge the exceptional quality of the strategic work Sarah has presented today. This represents exactly the kind of comprehensive thinking we need to guide our national expansion, and it demonstrates capabilities that would be valuable for ongoing strategic consultation as we implement these recommendations. The feedback was gratifying, but I also knew that the real test would come in the board's private deliberations and their ultimate decision about whether to adopt my strategic recommendation. Board-level approval was necessary for implementing the kind of comprehensive changes I had proposed, and it would also determine whether our consulting relationship would extend beyond this initial project. Rebecca Williams initiated the discussion by addressing the competitive implications of the transformation partnership positioning. This approach creates differentiation that would be difficult for competitors to replicate quickly, she observed. It requires operational capabilities and cultural changes that take time to develop, which gives us the potential for sustained competitive advantage. Dr. Pedersen supported the strategic direction while emphasizing the importance of ensuring that wellness programming and health outcomes measurement would be integrated authentically rather than as superficial marketing additions. His medical expertise provided credibility for the health-focused elements of the strategy, while also identifying potential partnerships with healthcare providers that could enhance service delivery. Maria Santos focused on the operational feasibility of implementing the transformation partnership approach across multiple locations simultaneously. She advocated for an even more conservative rollout timeline that would allow for thorough testing and refinement before committing to full-scale expansion. Thomas Chen raised important questions about intellectual property protection and competitive intelligence, noting that the strategic concepts I had developed would need to be carefully protected as Pinnacle began implementation. He also suggested that our consulting agreement should include provisions for ongoing strategic development as market conditions evolved. The discussion continued for another 45 minutes, with board members exploring various aspects of the strategic recommendations, while expressing general enthusiasm for the proposed direction. Their questions revealed sophisticated understanding of both the opportunities and challenges involved in implementing comprehensive strategic changes within a growing organization. As the formal meeting concluded, Michael Harrison asked me to step outside while the board conducted their private deliberations about adoption and next steps. David Chen accompanied me to a smaller conference room where we waited for the board's decision while discussing potential modifications to the implementation timeline based on the feedback we had received. The response was extremely positive, David observed as we reviewed the questions and comments from various board members. They clearly understand the value of what you've proposed, and their concerns are focused on execution rather than strategic direction. I appreciated his confidence, but I also knew that board decisions often involved considerations beyond the immediate quality of strategic recommendation. Budget constraints, risk tolerance, competitive timing, and individual board member priorities could all influence the ultimate decision regardless of how well the presentation had been received. 30 minutes later, Michael Harrison invited us back into the main conference room where the board had reconvened to communicate their decision. The expressions around the table suggested positive news, but I maintained professional composure while waiting for official confirmation. The board has voted unanimously to adopt your strategic recommendations, Michael announced with obvious satisfaction. We're authorizing immediate implementation of the pilot program in 3 locations, with plans for full-scale rollout beginning in 6 months. We're also extending our consulting relationship to include ongoing strategic guidance throughout the implementation process. The relief and excitement I felt were overwhelming, but I managed to maintain professional demeanor while expressing appreciation for their confidence and outlining next steps for beginning implementation planning. The victory represented not only validation of my strategic capabilities, but also establishment of the kind of prestigious client relationship that would anchor my independent consulting practice. Rebecca Williams added her perspective on the decision and the factors that had influenced the board's enthusiasm for the proposed strategy. This represents exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need to differentiate Pinnacle in an increasingly competitive market, she said. Your approach integrates consumer insights, operational realities, and growth planning in ways that create sustainable competitive advantages. As we concluded the meeting and began discussing the contractual arrangements for our expanded consulting relationship, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months earlier, I had been struggling to defend myself against false accusations of sabotage and credit stealing at Hartwell Marketing. Today, I was establishing myself as a strategic consultant whose insights would guide a major corporation's national expansion. The professional vindication was deeply satisfying, but the personal growth that had resulted from navigating betrayal and rebuilding my career was equally valuable. I had learned important lessons about resilience, strategic thinking, and the complex dynamics that shaped professional relationships in competitive industry. The success with Pinnacle also represented validation of my decision to integrate family connections with merit-based professional development, rather than artificially limiting myself to one approach or the other. The strategic value I provided was genuine and substantial, but my ability to facilitate potential partnerships with Mitchell Global Enterprises added another dimension of value that enhanced the overall client relationship. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave Pinnacle's offices, David Chen pulled me aside to discuss the broader implications of the successful presentation and board decision. "This is going to establish your reputation in the industry," he said with obvious satisfaction. "Word about this kind of strategic success spreads quickly among corporate leadership circles, and you're going to find yourself with more opportunities than you can handle." His prediction proved accurate sooner than either of us expected. Within 2 weeks of the Pinnacle presentation, I received inquiries from 3 other companies seeking strategic consulting services for their own expansion and repositioning initiative. The combination of my demonstrated capabilities and the prestige of the Pinnacle relationship created exactly the kind of momentum that successful independent consultants needed to build sustainable practices. The foundation had been laid for the next phase of my career development, but I also knew that the real work was just beginning. Implementing the transformation partnership strategy at Pinnacle would require months of intensive collaboration with their operational teams, careful measurement of customer response, and continuous refinement of service delivery process. More importantly, the success with Pinnacle had taught me valuable lessons about the relationship between strategic thinking and practical implementation that would guide my approach to future client relationships. The most sophisticated strategic recommendations were worthless without careful attention to operational realities and organizational culture factors that could either support or undermine successful execution. As I drove back to my apartment that evening, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The sabotage and betrayal at Hartwell Marketing had been painful and disorienting, but it had also forced me to develop independence, resilience, and strategic thinking capabilities that I might never have discovered within traditional agency structure. The colleagues who had worked so systematically to undermine my career had inadvertently provided me with exactly the catalyst I needed to discover my authentic professional path. Their manipulation and deception had been intended to eliminate me as competition, but it had instead created opportunities for advancement and fulfillment that exceeded anything I could have achieved within their limited framework. The next morning brought the beginning of implementation planning for Pinnacle's transformation partnership strategy, but it also marked the true beginning of Sarah Mitchell's strategic consulting as a recognized player in the corporate strategy field. The foundation had been built through exceptional work and authentic relationship development, but the real measure of success would come through consistent delivery of results that justified clients' confidence and investment. The journey from sabotage to vindication had been completed, but the more important journey of building a career based on integrated capabilities and authentic relationships was just beginning. I looked forward to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead, confident that I had developed the strategic thinking, operational expertise, and professional relationships necessary for sustained success in an increasingly competitive industry. The phone call came exactly 1 year after my presentation to Pinnacle's board of directors. I was in my new downtown office, reviewing quarterly performance metrics from 3 major clients, when my assistant announced that Marcus Chen was on the line requesting an urgent conversation. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me as I contemplated whether to take the call from the man who had systematically sabotaged my career and stolen our collaborative work. Put him through, I decided, curious about what desperation had driven him to contact me after a year of silence. Marcus's voice carried none of the confident collaboration I remembered from our time at Hartwell Marketing. Instead, he sounded strained and uncertain, clearly struggling with whatever situation had prompted this unexpected outrage. "Sarah, I know you probably don't want to hear from me," he began, "but I'm facing some serious legal problems, and I think you're the only person who might be able to help me understand what's happening." The request was audacious given our history, but I was genuinely curious about what consequences had finally caught up with him. "What kind of legal problems are you referring to, Marcus?" "Pinnacle Fitness is suing me for intellectual property theft and fraudulent misrepresentation," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "They're also going after the agency that hired me, and they're demanding millions in damage. I don't understand how they found out about the file deletion or how they connected it to the work I did at Sterling and Associates." I felt a grim satisfaction hearing that the sophisticated investigation David Chen had conducted was finally yielding consequences for Marcus's betrayal. For a year, I had wondered whether justice would ever be served for the systematic sabotage that had nearly destroyed my career. "Marcus, I'm not sure why you think I can help you with this situation," I replied, maintaining professional neutrality despite my personal feelings about his predicament. "If Pinnacle has evidence of intellectual property theft, that's a matter between you, your legal representation, and their attorneys." "Please, Sarah," he said, and I could hear genuine panic in his voice. "I know what I did was wrong. I know I betrayed your trust and sabotaged the team. But I never intended for it to become this complicated. I thought I was just taking advantage of a business opportunity." The admission was both gratifying and pathetic. After a year of wondering whether Marcus had ever felt any remorse for his actions, I was hearing him acknowledge the betrayal while simultaneously trying to minimize its significance and seek my assistance in avoiding consequences. "Marcus, you systematically destroyed months of collaborative work, fabricated complaints about my professional behavior, and stole intellectual property to advance your own career," I said, my professional composure giving way to honest emotional response. "The fact that the consequences have become complicated doesn't change the fundamental nature of what you chose to do." I know," he said quickly. "But Sarah, they're not just going after me, they're investigating Amanda too, and they're looking into Jennifer's role in the whole situation. This could destroy everyone who was involved." The revelation that Pinnacle's legal action extended beyond Marcus to other members of our former team was unexpected and concerning. While I had no sympathy for Marcus's predicament, I felt genuine worry about Amanda and Jennifer, who had been manipulated participants rather than primary architects of the deception. "What exactly is Pinnacle alleging about Amanda and Jennifer?" I asked, my concern overriding my anger about Marcus's situation. "Their lawyers are claiming that Amanda knowingly participated in a conspiracy to steal intellectual property, and that Jennifer failed to exercise adequate supervision that allowed the theft to occur," Marcus explained. "They're saying that the pattern of complaints about your behavior was orchestrated to create conditions that would justify excluding you from credit and recognition." The legal theory was sophisticated and largely accurate, but I was troubled by the implications for people who had been as much victims of Marcus's manipulation as I had been. Amanda's willingness to fabricate complaints about my collaboration style had been wrong, but she had genuinely believed she was addressing legitimate workplace issues rather than participating in intellectual property theft. "Marcus, I still don't understand what you think I can do to help with this situation," I said, though I was beginning to suspect what he was hoping for. "Could you talk to Pinnacle's legal team?" he asked, confirming my suspicion. "Could you explain that Amanda and Jennifer weren't really part of the planning, that I manipulated them into participating without understanding the full scope of what I was doing?" The request put me in a difficult position. On one hand, I genuinely believed that Amanda and Jennifer deserved consideration for their unwitting participation in Marcus's scheme. On the other hand, I had no obligation to assist people who had contributed to the professional betrayal that had nearly destroyed my career, regardless of their level of awareness about Marcus's ultimate intention. "I'll consider whether there's anything appropriate I can communicate to Pinnacle's attorneys," I said, finally. "But Marcus, you need to understand that I'm not going to compromise my own professional relationships or legal standing to help you avoid consequences for choices you made deliberately." After ending the call, I sat in my office contemplating the complex emotions that Marcus's predicament had stirred up. The vindication was deeply satisfying after a year of rebuilding my career and reputation, but I also felt genuine concern about the collateral damage that legal action might cause for people who had been manipulated rather than malicious. I decided to call David Chen to discuss the situation and understand better what Pinnacle hoped to achieve through their legal action against my former colleague. David had become not just a legal advisor but a trusted professional contact whose judgment I respected, and I wanted his perspective on both the legal and ethical dimensions of the situation. "Sarah, I was wondering when you might reach out about this," David said when I explained Marcus's call and my concerns about Amanda and Jennifer. "Pinnacle's legal strategy is designed to send a clear message about intellectual property protection, but they're also interested in ensuring that justice is proportional to actual culpability." "What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means they're willing to consider testimony from you about the relative roles different people played in the conspiracy," David explained. "Your perspective as the primary victim would carry significant weight in helping them understand who deserves the most serious consequences and who might deserve more lenient treatment." The opportunity to influence the legal outcomes for my former colleagues was both empowering and burdensome. I had the chance to ensure that justice was served proportionally, but I also had to navigate complex feelings about people who had contributed to my professional suffering even if they hadn't understood the full scope of Marcus's deception. Over the following week, I met with Pinnacle's legal team to provide detailed testimony about the events leading up to the file deletion and my observations about each team member's role in the conspiracy. The conversation was thorough and professional, focusing on factual observations rather than emotional interpretations of people's motivations and intentions. I explained that Marcus had clearly been the primary architect of the deception, with access to information and capabilities that the others lacked. I testified that Amanda's complaints about my behavior appeared to be genuine concerns that had been encouraged and amplified by Marcus rather than fabricated accusations created for strategic purposes. I described Jennifer's responses as consistent with a supervisor trying to manage legitimate team dynamics rather than someone aware of an underlying conspiracy. The legal team was particularly interested in the timeline of events and the specific ways that Marcus had manipulated situations to create opportunities for sabotage while positioning others to take blame or responsibility. My testimony helped them understand the sophisticated nature of his deception and the extent to which he had exploited his colleagues' trust and professional relationships. 3 months later, David Chen called to update me on the resolution of Pinnacle's legal action. The outcomes reflected the nuanced understanding of culpability that had emerged through investigation and testimony. Marcus faced the most serious consequences, including financial damages, a permanent injunction against using Pinnacle's intellectual property, and a criminal referral for computer fraud that could result in federal charge. Sterling and Associates, the agency that had hired him, agreed to substantial financial settlements and implemented new policies for verifying the provenance of strategic work contributed by new employees. Amanda received a formal censure and was required to attend professional ethics training, but she avoided financial penalties or permanent career damage. Jennifer faced temporary suspension from her supervisory role at Hartwell Marketing, while the agency reviewed their policies for intellectual property protection and team management. Pinnacle feels that justice has been served proportionally, David explained. Marcus bears primary responsibility for the deception and faces the most serious consequences. The others are receiving corrective action that reflects their level of involvement without destroying their career. The resolution felt fair and appropriate, addressing the harm that had been caused while recognizing the different levels of culpability among the participants. Marcus would face significant professional and legal consequences for his deliberate betrayal, while Amanda and Jennifer would have opportunities to learn from their mistakes without permanent career damage. The conclusion of the legal proceedings also marked the end of a chapter in my own professional development that had begun with sabotage and betrayal, but had ultimately led to opportunities and achievements that exceeded anything I could have accomplished within traditional agency structure. Sarah Mitchell's strategic consulting had grown into a respected practice with 6 full-time employees and a client roster that included some of the most prestigious brands in multiple industries. The success with Pinnacle had generated referrals and recognition that established my reputation as a strategic consultant, capable of delivering comprehensive solutions for complex business challenges. The integration of my family connections with merit-based professional development had created unique value propositions that differentiated my practice from traditional consulting competitors. Most importantly, I had learned valuable lessons about resilience, authentic professional relationships, and the complex dynamics that shaped career advancement in competitive industry. The experience of betrayal and recovery had taught me to pay closer attention to people's actions rather than their words, to document important communications systematically, and to trust my instincts when interpersonal dynamics felt inconsistent or manipulative. 6 months after the legal resolution, I received an unexpected email from Amanda Rodriguez. She had left Hartwell Marketing and was working at a smaller agency where she felt more aligned with the company culture and value. Her message was thoughtful and reflective, acknowledging her role in the events that had nearly destroyed my career while expressing genuine remorse for her actions. "I've spent a lot of time over the past year thinking about what happened and my part in it," she wrote. "I realize now that my complaints about your behavior were influenced more by my own insecurities and competitiveness than by legitimate professional concerns. I let Marcus manipulate my feelings into actions that were unfair to you and damaging to our team." The apology was meaningful, particularly because it demonstrated the kind of self-reflection and personal growth that suggested she had genuinely learned from the experience. I responded with appreciation for her honesty and encouragement for her continued professional development, but I also maintained appropriate boundaries about rebuilding personal relationships. The final piece of closure came a year later when Jennifer Walsh reached out to discuss a potential consulting project for Hartwell Marketing. The agency had undergone significant changes following the intellectual property scandal, including new leadership and revised policies for project management and team collaboration. "We've learned important lessons about the importance of authentic leadership and transparent communication," Jennifer explained during our initial conversation. "We'd like to engage your consulting services to help us rebuild our company culture and establish practices that support genuine collaboration rather than competitive manipulation." The irony of being asked to help repair the culture that had contributed to my own professional sabotage was not lost on me, but I was also intrigued by the opportunity to influence positive changes within the agency environment. After careful consideration, I agreed to a limited consulting engagement focused on developing policies and training programs that would prevent future incidents of intellectual property theft and workplace manipulation. The project with Hartwell Marketing proved to be professionally satisfying and personally healing, providing an opportunity to contribute to positive changes while demonstrating how much I had grown as a strategic thinker and organizational consultant. The work also validated my decision to integrate all aspects of my background and capabilities, rather than limiting myself to artificial constraints about merit and family connection. As I reflect on the journey from sabotage to vindication to professional success, I'm struck by how completely the experience transformed my understanding of career development, professional relationships, and authentic success. The betrayal that initially seemed like career-ending disaster ultimately created opportunities for growth and achievement that I could never have imagined within traditional employment structure. The colleagues who worked to undermine my credibility inadvertently forced me to develop independence, resilience, and strategic thinking capabilities that now serve me throughout my career. Their manipulation and deception were intended to eliminate me as competition, but instead they provided exactly the catalyst I needed to discover my authentic professional path. Sarah Mitchell's strategic consulting continues to grow and evolve, guided by principles of integrity, excellence, and authentic relationship building that were forged through the experience of betrayal and recovery. The foundation built through exceptional work and genuine client service has created a sustainable practice that generates meaningful impact for organizations, while providing personal fulfillment and professional satisfaction. The story of workplace sabotage and corporate betrayal that began with deleted files and false accusations had transformed into a narrative of resilience, growth, and ultimate success. The lessons learned through navigating deception and rebuilding credibility now inform every aspect of my professional practice, creating value not just for my own career development but for the clients and colleagues whose lives intersect with mine. Most importantly, The experience taught me that authentic success requires integrating all aspects of your background and capabilities, while maintaining unwavering commitment to integrity and excellence. The path from betrayal to vindication proved that staying true to your values, even when it's difficult, eventually leads you exactly where you're meant to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.